Russian men are attempting to flee the country in order to avoid a military call-up for the war in Ukraine. This week, President Vladimir Putin announced a partial military mobilization, which could see hundreds of thousands of people summoned to serve in the war.
President Putin also threatened nuclear retaliation, saying he was willing to use any military means necessary in the war effort. Earlier, I spoke to Dana Lewis, host of the podcast Backstory with Dana Lewis, and a former foreign correspondent based in Moscow, who told me that many Russians are looking to escape the conflict and the country.
It's one thing sitting at home and watching this conflict unfold, from the confines of your apartment, sitting on your sofa, but it's quite another when the militia shows up and starts demanding that you get on a bus. And that is what is happening. And, suddenly millions of Russians who maybe supported the war or were neutral about it suddenly find themselves having to go and report to a recruiting center under Putin's mobilization plan, or their sons or their grandsons. So it is an emotional moment inside Russia, and you can see that playing out on the borders now, right? Where people trying to flee to Georgia, to Mongolia, to Finland. The Baltic countries, Joanna, have closed their borders. They're saying, no, we are not going to be a haven for Russians. If they want to change this, they should change it within Russia. They should pressure their own government to stop this.
So has this mobilization further changed the sentiment in Russia towards the war?
Well, it's very early to tell, right? We're only 48, 72 hours into the middle of this, into this draft of Russians that the defense minister Shoigu said was going to be 300,000. And I think you have to be very careful of that number because, in fact, there are reports from Russian news sources, Novaya Gazeta, which is a very credible newspaper that was chased out of the country in the last year, but they still have very good sources within the Kremlin. They are saying that, in fact, the document says a million Russians can be forced to sign up and go and fight in Ukraine. So the former prime minister of Russia, Mikhail Kasyanov, who left earlier this year himself, told me that he thinks this will play out before December and that it will threaten the regime of Putin itself, that Russians will not sign up to mobilization in the long run. And the more this plays out on the streets, outside people's apartments, outside schools where students are being taken out of class and put into recruiting centers, in some of the poorest areas of Russia, where they are going and handing out these notices and forcing people to report and go and sign up for the Russian army fighting in Ukraine in a very brutal 1,000 kilometer long front that, as you know, the Russians have been pushed back from. As this plays out, it may threaten the regime itself. And I think that's why the Russians, the Kremlin, the Putin administration, his inner circle, were so hesitant to move towards mobilization. And in fact, had made promises in the summer that they weren't going to do this.
Many people have also turned out to protest against the war in Russia. Hundreds have been arrested for doing so. Is that resistance building, and will it have any impact?
I think the Russian authorities are scared how it could play out, and that's why they're being so brutal. And they are being very tough on the streets of Moscow and St. Petersburg, where a couple of thousand, the estimates are around 2,000 have been arrested. And now there are calls on social media for another demonstration on September the 24th. So we'll see how that goes. But remember, the suppression of opposition has been playing out over a year. They've broken opposition parties. They've forced free media to cut and run. And they have arrested many people who has supported Alexei Navalny, one of the main opposition leaders who has been jailed. So, the Russian authorities have been clamping down and almost paving the road for this for some time now.
Dana, what's the role for the West here?
The West defines this as an existential threat to Europe and to the liberal democracies. And that there's a lot on the line here. And if Putin is not stopped here, and he probably should have been stopped in a more firm way in 2014 when they took over Crimea, that he will continue on threatening Finland, threatening Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland. And that's why everybody in this, because they see this goal of Putin, who has been largely isolated during the pandemic, to suddenly recreate a Russian empire, as bizarre, as dangerous. And as Macron said, the French president, during the UN meetings this week, he thinks that Putin's state of mind is in question and that it is a result of being secluded during the pandemic. I mean, are we dealing with a crazy Russian leader with his finger on the nuclear weapon? A lot of people think we are.
Dana, it's obviously hard to know what's behind Vladimir Putin's actions, but what do the events of this week tell us about his thinking, about how Russia is positioned in this conflict?
I think the threat from Putin is to try and scare the West. And certainly it was ominous listening to his State of the Nation address, his address to the nation. And I've covered Putin for 20 years, since he came to power in 2000. With him leaning forward, kind of, wet-eyed, very intense. I think that there was some political theater there, and they are trying to scare the West off allowing Ukraine to retake these areas, which they appear to be doing. And the Russian army is crumbling in some areas. And even if you get new recruits in there, they're going to be equipped with what? Because they've lost so many tanks and pieces of artillery and aircraft. I think that Putin is doubling down. He doesn't see an exit ramp. The West doesn't need to give him one in many ways. And that's a criticism, because forcing Ukraine to go back to the negotiating table and talk to Russia about what? While there is this intense, brutal fighting going on, the Ukrainians will not support President Zelensky if he suddenly said, okay, let's give them X territory in the east, after so many Ukrainians have fought and bled to try to push the Russians out. I think that they're not going to give any ground to President Putin until they either beat them on the ground or force them to withdraw, or both.
That's Dana Lewis speaking with me earlier. He's a former foreign correspondent based in Moscow.